National Council of Educational Research and Training NCERT code application namta kumba khat sispa khat nyotali ki teaching vacancies but librarian tarik do kadai ar phau tarik banai ba ar hajar ar phau riu te ki ne ki kam hikai but librarian kidai ki ba haptrai hapo NCERT office hapo New Delhi nane haki wai pak units pakan top ki badan hapo Ajmer Bhopal Bhubaneswar Mysuru mbat Shillong. Tengah pat kamera ia kan ka jing pentep ka barang ya kan ka video. Kajing pentep na ka National Council of Educational Research and Training. Kajing pentep na mata ki ki kami kai kam librarian bat ki wai. Hapo kan ka National Council of Educational Research and Training na ta ki don kini ki centers prepare Bahapa po kajing pet jo kanai NCERT New Delhi kum ka Ajmer Bhopal hapo Bhubaneswar Mysuru bahapo Shillong kadon taka regional Neri kani ka pangitip kum ka Neri hapo Umiam Shillong tagi pos kam hikai bat ki wai nyapat ka wai hadin ka wai pat amta mathematics kadon ka wai ka pos artillery pos associate professor ba wai ka pos assistant the arts education professor ka wai assistant professor ka wai the bioscience and biotechnology or health science or pharmacy professor kawai assistant professor kawai the economics associate professor artillery assistant professor kawai namtaka subject zoology professor kawai the associate professor artillery assistant professor southerly educational technology multimedia associate professor kawai namta subject hindi associate professor artillery namta education science professor southerly associate professor artillery namta assistant professor artillery namta ka education teacher education professor kawai namta associate professor lightly assistant professor southerly tanangta education elementary education professor kawai associate professor artillery the educational psychology professor kawai associate professor kawai the subject history professor kawai associate professor kawai assistant professor artillery the subject geography professor kawai nangta population studies associate professor kawai nangta political science dan professor kawai but associate professor kawai the educational technology graphics multimedia associate professor kawai nangta special education professor kawai associate professor artillery assistant professor kawai the electronics or electrical or IT or renewable energy associate professor kawai the English professor kawai associate professor lightly assistant professor artillery the Urdu assistant professor kawai the hospitality or travel and tourism associate professor kawai the vocational education commerce accountancy associate professor kawai the vocational education professor kawai associate professor kawai the education curriculum development or research or policy associate professor kawai the psychology or education measurement and evaluation associate professor kawai the child development ECCE professor kawai associate professor kawai education mathematics education assistant professor artillery the education professor lightly associate professor Rutely assistant professor artillery the sociology associate professor artillery the assistant professor kawai the botany associate professor artillery assistant professor artillery the agriculture animal husbandry or fisheries or sericulture professor kawai nangta education philosophy of education assistant professor kawai nangta security or defense science or military science associate professor kawai the food technology and processing associate professor kawai nangta psychology or education guidance and counseling assistant professor kawai tanangta language education Hindi or English or Urdu or Sanskrit or linguistics assistant professor kawai the home science food and nutrition associate professor kawai the statistics associate professor kawai computer education assistant professor kawai the food and nutrition or biochemistry biotechnology professor kawai the philosophical and sociology foundation of education assistant professor kawai agriculture associate professor kawai, assistant professor kawai, nata physics associate professor kawai, assistant professor kawai, deputy librarian kawai, nata assistant librarian artillery, rural technology associate professor kawai, nata Telugu assistant professor kawai, life science and primary education associate professor kawai, the arts and aesthetics associate professor kawai, ita education is extension education assistant professor kawai, the extension education teacher education assistant professor kawai, physical education assistant professor kawai, chemistry professor kawai. Tegini abbreviations. Tarik bakado ya kan ka bantap kan de arpotrik haptap online lang bak hap apply online kadai arpotrik banai ba ajar arpon rio. Kini de educational qualifications dan taka post professor kidan ki eligibility A or B. Kidan kini bala papas ya ka PhD. Nah dan experience ko basi post nam nta ba abi but outstanding professional having PhD. Nta ba dan experience but kini ki industry dan academic but have done post nam experience. Associate professor, good academic record at PhD in concern allied relevant disciplines. A master degree with at least 55% marks. Have done prasnam experience sa teaching but kiway. Assistant professor karan ka A baka B eligibility master's degree with 55% marks or equivalent. Nata have done ro ya kiniki ya PhD ki kwa arban dan ikta PhD. Tahap pas tagi net bagi slat. Tanang ta PhD. Tanang ta deputy librarian master's degree with at least 55% marks or equivalent. The assistant librarian master degree with library science, information science, or document science or equivalent professional degree, 55% marks. Tegi ni ngam tan sepo, sampai sebut kali description, tegi buka bantap, saleh ke perangkap. Nta kajing siu ke professor kadang hadu ke poi laman poi entry kadai silak stafu sahajar aspa associate professor deputy librarian ke poi silak lai pu hajar spa assistant professor assistant librarian san po hanyo hajar new spa entry p. Tegi lagi jeng bentep apply online lang bakal NCERT website yang sebut kali description kasdang lah dok lai poi tarik kajing apply online te ka last date kadai arpo tarik banai ba ajar penriu. Tekan siu kadai si hajar yaki S yaki UR OBC ban EWS yaki SC ST dan kam ban siu. Tekan lagi bagi jing tak 60 benek. Kita beran kam badan qualification beran kam bat pakwa ban tip kam dia sabuk kali pot description bat 10 benek hi bat sapendap ya ka application jangpi hana sya ka tarik pakado ban kod kembala peta kata syua ka arpau tarik penai baar ara cara penri. Di tanggina hi kejing pentep leng bakan ke NCERT kumbasis pak kan yu teliki kam hikai nang kam deputy librarian but assistant librarian kublai sibun ya pi barok ke papai ya kan ika video.